The sky of Turnus burned like a dying star. Black smoke rose from the ruined city towers, and the wind carried the smell of melted steel and dust. The last fortress stood like a wounded beast, its walls cracked, its defense guns silent, its energy shields flickering weakly. What had once been a proud world was now nothing more than a battlefield. Inside the fortress, the great hall was filled with soldiers, healers, and frightened civilians. Their faces were tired, their uniforms torn. Most of them had not slept for days. Their queen stood at the center of the hall, her silver armor scratched and blackened by battle. She was tall and strong, with glowing blue eyes and silver marks on her skin. Her name was Leora, the last queen of Turnus. She faced a large round table. A giant screen above it showed empty star charts. Lines blinked where distress signals had been sent to their allies. Every corner of space they reached out to showed the same cold response: silence. Leora placed both hands on the table and whispered, "Still no answer?" Her commander, a scarred alien named Bren, shook his head slowly. "No, my queen, the other systems ignore us. The fleets that once called us friends have turned away." Leora's eyes narrowed. "They fear the enemy." Bren clenched his fist. "Yes, they don't want to fight the swarm. They think helping us will bring the same destruction to their worlds." A quiet murmur filled the hall. The soldiers listened even though they pretended not to. They already knew the truth. Turnus was alone. No one was coming to save them. The queen straightened her back. Her cape dragged against the cold floor. "Then we will stand alone," she said in a firm voice. Bren looked at her as if trying to believe those words, but even he felt the weight of reality. Their armies were broken. Their ships were gone. Their supplies were almost finished. The enemy, called the Swarm, was not just powerful, they were endless. They devoured worlds and left only ash behind. The fortress had only a few days left. In a small dark room under the main hall, rows of broken communication consoles flickered. A young technician sat at one of the chairs staring at the last active transmitter. She was thin, with gray skin and tired yellow eyes. Her name was Rin. She had sent over 1,000 distress signals in the last 2 weeks. None had answered. Still, she whispered the same message one more time as if it were a prayer. "This is the royal fortress of Turnus. We are under attack by the swarm. Our defenses are failing. We beg for aid. If anyone can hear us, please respond." Her voice was soft and cracked, and the console buzzed quietly as the signal went into the endless dark of space. High above the burning planet, hundreds of enemy ships floated like black knives. The swarm fleet did not sleep, did not speak, did not feel. It only advanced. They had surrounded Turnus from every direction, waiting for the final order to strike. The alien soldiers in the fortress watched the sky through broken windows and knew it was only a matter of time. In the war room, Bren pointed to a map. "Their next wave will come at dawn. We cannot stop it." Leora looked at the blinking red lights moving closer. "How many soldiers left?" 2,000. Maybe less, and most of them are tired. And weapons? Half of the guns are broken. We have power for only one shield cycle. Once that falls, they will walk through us." Leora fell silent. She was a queen, but right now, she felt more like a captain standing at the edge of a sinking ship. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that brief silence, she remembered how Turnus once looked: green skies, shining cities, and music in the streets. Those days were gone. She turned to her people and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "Listen to me. If no one comes, we still fight. If the sky falls, we still stand. Let the swarm remember the name of Turnus." The hall filled with the sound of fists hitting armor. Her people shouted their war cry. It was not because they believed they could win. It was because they refused to die without honor. Far away from Turnus, deep in the Black Sea of space, a small human cargo ship floated silently. It was not a warship, not even a proper combat vessel. It carried old equipment and spare parts. Its hull had scratches and its engines made a soft humming noise. Inside the ship sat Ray, a human pilot with dark hair and calm eyes. He wore a simple flight jacket, stained with old oil marks. He was traveling alone to a trade station, far from any war zone. He liked silence. He liked the stars. The radio suddenly cracked. A weak signal broke through the static. It was shaky and tired, but it was clear enough. "This is the royal fortress of Turnus. We are under attack by the swarm. We beg for aid. If anyone can hear us, please respond." Ray leaned back in his chair. Turnus? He whispered to himself. He had heard the name before. A proud world, famous for its advanced technology, but also a world at war for a long time. He opened the map. The coordinates were far. It would take time to get there, and the swarm was not something anyone would face alone. He looked at the blinking red dot on his radar and thought for a long moment. He could ignore it. He could keep flying and forget, but he didn't. Ray slowly switched on his engines, changed his course, and whispered to the empty ship. All right, then. Back at the fortress, Rin stared at the console. Another hour had passed with no answer. Her voice grew weaker, but she tried again. This is the royal fortress of Turnus. We beg for aid. If anyone can hear us... The console blinked. Her heart skipped a beat, a signal, weak but real. She jumped from her chair and shouted, Queen Leora! Someone answered. Moments later, Leora and Bren rushed into the communication room. The small hologram screen flickered to life, showing only static. Then a male voice came through. This is Ray, human pilot. I received your message. The room fell silent. A human? Just one? Bren frowned. A single pilot can't help us. It must be some mistake, but Leora didn't say anything. She leaned closer to the console. Human Ray, this is Queen Leora of Turnus. We are under siege by the swarm. Our defenses are almost gone. There was a short pause on the line. Then Ray's calm voice answered. Understood. I'm on my way. Rin's eyes widened. Bren shook his head, not believing what he heard. He can't be serious. Leora stared at the flickering signal. He is. Outside the fortress walls, the night grew darker. The enemy fleet gathered for the next strike. Alien soldiers repaired what they could, moved the wounded to the inner chambers, and prepared to face the storm again. Above them, strange black ships hovered like vultures over a dying prey. Queen Leora stood on the highest balcony. Cold wind blew against her face. Her silver eyes looked at the stars. Will one human make any difference? Bren asked softly behind her. She didn't look back. Maybe not. But he answered when no one else did. Bren said nothing after that. Deep down, even he felt a small spark of something he had not felt for weeks. Hope. On his small ship, Ray checked his old weapons. A few railguns, a pulse cannon, and 2 crates of explosive mines. Not much against a whole swarm fleet. But he had something more important than numbers. He had no intention of running. He looked at the star map. Hold on, he whispered to the unknown people on Turnus. I'm coming. The engines roared as the human ship jumped into hyperspace. At dawn, the fortress walls trembled as the first wave of swarm fighters approached. Thousands of black ships filled the horizon. The alien soldiers raised their weapons and locked the shield systems. Leora walked down to the front line. Her soldiers saw her and straightened their backs. Even facing death, their queen stood with them. Bren came running. The human ship is on approach vector. 1 vessel. 1, she repeated softly. But in that single word she found strength. She lifted her sword and raised her voice so everyone could hear. Today we do not die as prey. Today we stand. The soldiers roared in reply, their voices echoing through the broken towers. The enemy ships drew closer, and far above them, cutting through the burning sky, a small human cargo ship appeared like a lone spark of light. One human had answered. The fortress walls shook as the first wave of swarm fighters filled the sky. Black ships moved like a storm cloud, their red lights glowing through the dark morning. The enemy's engines made a deep humming sound that vibrated through the ground like thunder. Inside the fortress, alien soldiers rushed to their positions. Alarms rang through the halls. Healers moved the wounded deeper inside the base, while engineers tried to keep the damaged shield generator alive a little longer. Every heartbeat was heavy with the sound of war. Queen Leora stood on the upper platform with Commander Bren beside her. She watched the horizon with cold eyes. The swarm was closer than ever before. One more full attack and their walls would fall. Shields at 30%, Bren reported as green lines blinked on his wristpad. Hold them, she answered. Bren gave a small, dry laugh. Hold them with what, my queen? We are holding them with hope. Leora didn't smile. She didn't look away from the black ships in the sky. Then hope is what we have left. A loud sound broke through the alarms, a streak of light cutting across the sky. Soldiers pointed upward. Some shouted in confusion. It's not swarm. A lookout cried. It's another ship! The light grew brighter as it entered the atmosphere. The fortress scanners locked onto it. A small human cargo ship, old and beaten, pushed through the smoke and fire. It was small compared to the enemy fleet, but its engines burned strong and steady. Bren stared at the screen. "He came," Leora whispered. "Yes, he came." Ray sat in the pilot seat of his ship, his hands steady on the controls. The warning lights blinked red as the system detected dozens of enemy locks. Swarm fighters were already scanning him, preparing to attack. He didn't flinch. He turned off the safety systems, powered up his pulse cannons, and angled his ship toward the fortress below. "This is Ray," he said into the radio. "I'm coming in hot." Inside the fortress, Rin shouted, "He's requesting landing clearance." Bren grabbed the microphone. "You're flying into a war zone, human. You'll be shot down." Ray's voice came back calm, almost casual. "Not if I move faster." The next moment, the swarm opened fire. Red energy bolts cut through the air like rain. Ray twisted his ship sharply to the left. The old engine screamed, but he made the maneuver with precision. Energy bolts missed by meters, hitting the ruins below instead. Ray rolled the ship again, dove under one of the enemy fighters, and fired his pulse cannon. A bright flash exploded in the sky. One swarm fighter went down in smoke. The alien soldiers watching from the walls cheered loudly. They had not seen anyone take down a swarm fighter in weeks. Leora's eyes followed the human ship as it danced between the enemy formation like a fast bird among vultures. He didn't have a fleet. He didn't have backup, but he moved with confidence. Ray punched through the last defense line and reached the fortress landing pad. He dropped his ship hard onto the cracked metal floor. The landing gears creaked, but the ship held. Before the dust even settled, the ramp opened. Dozens of alien soldiers pointed their weapons at the ramp. They didn't know what to expect. Slowly, a single figure stepped down, a human in worn armor carrying a light pack and a pulse rifle across his back. His face was calm, his step steady. He looked more like a mechanic than a soldier. Bren walked forward with 2 guards. "You're the one who answered the call?" Ray gave a small nod. "Yeah," Bren frowned. "Where is your fleet?" Ray tilted his head slightly. "I don't have one." The commander stared at him in disbelief. "You came alone." Ray looked at the damaged walls, the smoke, and the tired soldiers. Then he looked at Bren. Yeah, someone had to. Behind Bren, the queen approached. Soldiers stepped aside to make a clear path. Her silver armor gleamed under the firelight. She looked at Ray with sharp eyes that had seen too many battles. "You are human," she said slowly. "Yes. And you came alone." "Yes." Leora stepped closer. She studied him not with fear, but with something else, curiosity. "Why?" Ray gave a small shrug. "Because no one else did." There was a silence between them. A strange kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of hopelessness. It was something different, something alive. Bren didn't trust him, but they had no time to argue. The swarm was already forming another wave. "Alarms rang again, they're coming," shouted one of the watchmen. Ray turned to Leora. "Show me your defenses." Leora blinked. "You want to help?" "Why else would I be here?" He replied. She nodded once. Bren led him through the corridors of the fortress, past broken machines, tired soldiers, and damaged gun turrets. When they reached the control room, Ray took one look at the map and understood their problem. "Your shield generator is too weak," he said, pointing at the blinking lines on the screen. "And half your guns are offline," Bren answered sharply. "We know." Ray ignored his tone. "The swarm is fast, but they follow patterns. You can redirect power to the west wall and set up a trap in the center. If we collapse part of the tower at the right time, we can block their main push." Bren crossed his arms. "That's a risky plan." Ray looked him in the eye. "So is dying." Leora's eyes focused on the human. She could see it in his voice. He wasn't speaking like someone guessing. He was speaking like someone who had done this before. "Do it," she said. Bren turned toward her, surprised. "My queen, do it," she repeated. "If we are to fall, we fall fighting." Bren hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. "Prepare the west wall." Ray moved fast. He climbed onto the broken wall with a team of alien soldiers, repairing power cables with quick hands. He shouted orders with confidence, and even though he was not their leader, the soldiers followed. They saw something in the way he moved, something sharp and unshakable. On the west wall, 2 alien gunners watched him fix the targeting system with a small tool kit. One of them whispered, "He's not afraid." The other answered softly, "He's human." When the last cable clicked into place, the cannon lights came back on. The soldiers cheered again. Ray wiped the sweat from his face, grabbed his rifle, and climbed higher on the ruined tower. Bren joined him. "Do humans always fight like this?" he asked in a low voice. Ray gave a half-smile. "Most of the time, yeah." The swarm fighters moved like a dark wave over the battlefield. Their ships split into 3 groups coming from east, north, and center. Ray watched their movement through the cracked tower glass. He was reading their formation, looking for a weak point. He saw it in seconds. "They're using the same pattern," he said. "Good." Leora's voice came through the radio. "We are ready." Ray raised his rifle and gave the signal. The cannons roared. Energy blasts lit up the morning sky. Alien soldiers shouted their war cries as the first enemy fighters entered the trap. Ray's plan worked. When the swarm pushed toward the center, the fortress triggered a charge under the broken tower. The wall collapsed at the perfect moment, creating a wall of fire and debris. Several enemy ships crashed into it. For the first time in many battles, the fortress scored a real victory. The soldiers shouted louder. Hope flickered like fire in their eyes. Bren looked at the human and said, "You really came here to fight." Ray kept his eyes on the sky. "I came here to win." But the swarm was not finished. A larger wave of fighters appeared on the horizon, followed by a massive black cruiser. The fortress shook under the weight of its arrival. The soldiers' cheers faded as they saw the enormous ship. Bren's voice tensed. "That's a command cruiser." Leora's voice came through the radio, calm but firm. "Hold the line." Ray scanned the enemy formation. "They'll try to crush your defenses in one big push. If they break through the west wall, everything falls." Bren replied, "Then we hold the wall." Ray shook his head. "No, I'll hold the wall." He jumped down, landing hard on the cracked floor, and ran to the west defense line. Bren shouted after him, but the human didn't stop. He climbed up the damaged turret, grabbed the control handles, and aimed at the incoming cruiser. The soldiers stared in disbelief. One human was standing alone on the wall, aiming at a ship 100 times bigger than his own. Leora watched from the command tower. For a moment, her heartbeat slowed. She had seen many soldiers fight bravely, but this was different. The human didn't fight because he was ordered to. He fought because he chose to. The enemy fired. Energy beams slammed against the shield. The wall trembled. Ray fired back. The turret roared like thunder. One swarm fighter exploded in the air, then another. He moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, aiming fast, never wasting a shot. The soldiers behind him began to shout again, not in fear this time, but in strength. "For Turnus." Someone cried. Ray smirked and fired again. The battle grew louder. Smoke filled the air. The enemy cruiser opened its main cannon. The fortress shields flickered. Rin screamed into the radio. "Shields down to 10%. Ray gritted his teeth, holding his ground. He had no army behind him, but he refused to fall back. Bren ran to the queen. "We can't hold for long." Leora looked at the wall where the human stood. "He's still standing." Bren followed her eyes. The human turret glowed red from overheating, but Ray didn't stop. "A single figure against an army. Send power from the lower levels to the west shield," Leora ordered. "Everything we have. But that will do it." Power surged through the walls. The shield flared to life once more, just as the enemy's main beam struck. The explosion lit the entire battlefield. When the light faded, the fortress still stood, and on the west wall the human still held his ground. Leora let out a slow breath. She whispered to herself, "One human." The swarm pulled back slightly, regrouping for another attack. For now the fortress still stood. For now they had survived another hour. But what changed wasn't just the battle. It was the feeling in the air. The soldiers who once whispered about death now looked at the sky with fire in their eyes. Someone had answered their call. Someone was fighting beside them, and it wasn't just anyone. It was a human. The sun rose weakly over the ruins of Turnus. The fortress walls were cracked and the air smelled of smoke, but the flag still flew high. The alien soldiers gathered near the west wall, their armor blackened by the fight. Some leaned on broken cannons, some on their swords. They were tired, but their eyes burned brighter than before. The human had fought like a storm. Ray had stood on the wall through the heaviest fire. Even when the shield flickered and the turret overheated, he had not stepped back. His hands were still covered in dust and burn marks, but his face carried the calm of someone who refused to give up. Queen Leora walked through the fortress yard. Soldiers straightened their backs as she passed. She climbed the steps to the west wall and found Ray sitting on the edge, wiping oil from his rifle. The sun painted the battlefield gold. Enemy wreckage lay scattered far beyond the walls. The swarm had pulled back, but not for long. She stood beside him in silence for a few moments. The wind carried the sound of distant engines. The swarm was preparing their next attack. "You fought well," she said finally. Ray glanced at her. "I didn't have a choice." "Yes, you did," she replied softly. "You could have stayed away. You could have left us." Ray looked back at the horizon. "Maybe, but someone had to come." Leora studied him quietly. She had led thousands into battle. She had seen soldiers die bravely. But this human who came alone carried something different inside him. He had no throne to protect, no army, no duty here. Yet he stood and fought like it was his own home. Down below, Commander Bren walked through the engineering bay. Machines hummed weakly, power lines sparked, and exhausted engineers worked with shaking hands. Rin was sitting at her console, her face pale but focused. She was rerouting energy from the lower levels to the shield core. Bren leaned over her shoulder. "Can we keep the shield up?" She shook her head slowly. "Not for long. We lost too many power cells during the last wave. One more full strike and the shield will break." Bren pressed his hand against the cold metal wall. "Then we must fight without it." Rin looked up at him. "Without the shield, the fortress will not last more than an hour," he sighed. "Then an hour is what we will give." Back on the wall, Leora turned to Ray. "The next attack will be worse. The swarm won't hold back. They will throw everything they have." Ray nodded slowly. "I know." She crossed her arms. "We are not many. 2,000 soldiers, half of them wounded. Our shield is dying. Our walls are weak." He stood up and faced her. "Then we make them regret every step they take." Leora raised an eyebrow. "How?" Ray looked around the fortress, the broken towers, the empty guns, the piles of spare metal. "You don't need to be stronger," he said. "You just need to be smarter." She tilted her head slightly. "You have a plan." He gave a short nod. "I've seen swarm battles before. They rely on numbers and fear. But they don't change their tactics fast. If we set the right traps, we can hold them." Hours later, the entire fortress moved like a living machine. Soldiers carried metal plates to block narrow passages. Engineers dug holes and placed explosive charges. Old weapon crates were turned into makeshift mines. Ray climbed towers, adjusted angles of cannons, and mapped the enemy's likely path on a large board in the war room. Bren watched him work. "You act like you've done this 100 times. Ray didn't look up. "Close enough. What were you before this?" Bren asked. Ray paused for a second, then gave a half smile. "A pilot. A fighter. A human who's seen too many wars." Bren nodded slowly. "Then you understand what this means." Ray tightened a loose cable. "I do. It means we don't run." The swarm fleet moved in the dark skies, their ships aligning into attack formation. Thousands of fighters formed a long wave stretching across the horizon. The massive cruiser at the center pulsed with red light. Their attack would begin at sunset. The fortress would have only one night to stand. Inside the war room, Leora gathered everyone around the map. "This is our last stand," she said. "We will not retreat. We will not surrender." Ray stood beside her, pointing at weak points on the map. "They'll hit the west wall again. That's where we hit them hardest. They'll want revenge. We'll make them pay for it." Bren added, "Every soldier will have a task. No one breaks formation. If one wall falls, we all fall." The soldiers pounded their fists against their armor. It wasn't a cheer. It was a promise. As the sun began to sink behind the ruined city, Ray walked through the fortress. He passed tired faces, old walls, and silent guns. Soldiers looked at him with quiet respect. At first they saw him as a stranger. Now they saw him as something else, a fighter who stood with them. Rin approached him shyly. Her hands were still covered in dust from the communication console. "Human," she said, "I sent out the signal again. No one else has answered." Ray smiled faintly. "That's okay. We've got what we need right here. But there are so many of them," she said in a low voice. "Why are you not afraid?" He looked at her with calm eyes. "I've learned something, Rin. Fear doesn't stop death. But courage makes the enemy fear you." Her eyes widened slightly. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. Night fell. The fortress lights flickered as power was shifted to the front lines. The swarm ships began to move, their engines glowing red like a storm of fire in the sky. The alien soldiers took their positions on the wall. Cannons aimed upward. Mines were armed. Traps were ready. Ray climbed the central tower with a small headset on his ear. "Everyone ready?" Bren's voice came from below. "We're ready," Leora's voice followed. "The swarm is approaching. All soldiers to defense positions." Ray took a deep breath and looked at the horizon. The enemy wave was enormous. The sound of their engines was like the growl of a giant beast. He could feel the vibration in his chest. "All right," he whispered. "Let's make some noise." The swarm fired first. A rain of red energy bolts crashed against the shields. Sparks flew. The walls trembled. Rin screamed into the radio, "Shield down to 40%. Ray opened fire from the tower, hitting one of the enemy fighters with a precise shot. The ship exploded in a bright flash. Alien soldiers followed, their cannons roaring. The night sky became a battlefield of light and smoke. The first wave hit the west wall. Dozens of enemy drones swarmed over the broken ground. They walked fast, their claws cutting into the dirt. But they didn't see the traps hidden beneath the surface. Ray gave the signal. The mines exploded, throwing metal and fire into the air. The enemy line broke apart. Soldiers shouted their war cry and fired again. Bren led a unit down to block the broken gate. The sound of battle filled every corner of the fortress. Up in the tower, Ray switched positions and fired at another wave of ships. His hands moved fast, steady, trained. The alien soldiers saw him work the cannon like it was a part of him. They fired with more courage when they saw him leading from the front. One young soldier near the east wall shouted, "The human doesn't hide." Another replied, "Then neither will we." The enemy cruiser fired its main cannon. A massive red beam slammed against the shield. The generator screamed as the energy overloaded. Rin shouted through the radio, "Shield down to 10%. Ray's jaw tightened. He grabbed the radio. "Leora, now!" Leora's troops activated the second trap. A row of old cargo tanks exploded under the cruiser's forward fighters. Fire rolled through the air like a wave. Swarm fighters crashed into each other. Cheers filled the fortress again. For every step the swarm took, they paid for it in fire and metal. But the enemy kept coming. Their numbers were endless. The shield flickered and finally collapsed. A red alarm filled the night. "The shield is down," Rin cried. "We have no more power." Ray jumped down from the tower and landed near Bren. "Now we fight without it." The enemy drones climbed the walls. The fortress shook under their weight. Alien soldiers met them with swords, rifles, and bare hands. The night turned into chaos. Ray grabbed his rifle and charged toward the front gate. A huge drone leapt toward him, its claws sharp and fast. Ray rolled under its swing, pressed his rifle to its core, and fired. The machine exploded in sparks. He stood up and kept moving, covering soldiers who fought at the lower gates. Leora stood on the steps of the central keep. Her sword flashed as she cut through one of the enemy drones. Soldiers around her shouted and fought harder when they saw their queen in the front lines. She looked toward the west wall and saw Ray standing alone again, holding the line like a wall of his own. He was covered in dust and smoke, but his eyes burned like fire. "He's not just fighting," Bren said beside her. "He's leading them." She nodded slowly. "Yes, that's what humans do." The battle lasted through the night. Every time the swarm pushed forward, the fortress pushed back. The traps Ray had planned turned the battlefield into a maze of fire. The aliens of Turnus, who had felt fear for so long, now shouted their war cry without shaking hands. They had started this night believing it would be their last. But now, they believed something else. They believed they could win. The night on Turnus was heavy and silent, but everyone inside the fortress could feel the coming storm. The alien soldiers gathered in the broken courtyard. Smoke from the earlier battle still hung in the air. Broken walls and shattered towers were their only shield now. Their eyes turned toward the same man who had arrived alone yet stood like an army. Ray was standing near the shield generator, tightening the last power lines with steady hands. His armor was scratched and dust covered his face, but his eyes were calm. Queen Leora walked toward him, her golden armor faintly glowing under the cold moonlight. "The enemy fleet is moving. Our scouts say their main force is only hours away," she said. Ray didn't look up. He kept working, connecting wires and fusing parts together. "Good," he replied simply. "Then we don't have to wait long." Leora frowned. "Good? You're not afraid?" He finally turned to her. "Fear doesn't help. Preparation does." Leora studied him for a moment. Her people were strong, but they had lost their will to fight. Ray carried no flag, no army, but his quiet confidence filled the air like fire spreading through dry wood. She nodded slowly. Then we prepare. The alien soldiers gathered around as Ray began to explain his plan. He drew a rough map on the dusty ground with a broken piece of metal. The enemy will come from 3 directions. They'll hit hard and fast. You can't stop them with numbers. But you can make their strength work against them. The soldiers listened closely. He pointed to the broken towers on the north wall. We rig explosives here. When their heavy walkers come in, we bring the towers down. The falling stone will crush the first wave. He moved to the east gate. Here, we leave it open just enough to make them believe they can break through. But under the ground, we place the mines we took from the supply bay. When they rush in, we close the gate and trap them inside. Finally, he turned to the south. That's where I'll be. They'll try to break the shield generator. If they do, the fortress falls. So I'll make sure they don't. One of the alien commanders, a tall soldier named Oren, stepped forward. You're just one human. That's where their main force will attack. How can you hold them? Ray's voice was calm. Because they'll expect fear, but I don't give them that. Silence filled the courtyard for a moment. Then slowly one soldier nodded. Another raised their weapon. Confidence was spreading like light in darkness. Leora placed a hand on his shoulder. If this is our end, she said softly, then we will fight beside you. The preparation lasted through the night. Soldiers climbed the walls to fix broken cannons. Others laid traps in the shadows. The sound of tools, footsteps, and quiet orders filled the air. For the first time in weeks, the fortress was alive. Ray climbed the south wall, checking the field beyond. The enemy fleet was visible on the horizon now, glowing like a storm of red stars. He could see the dark shapes of their war machines moving closer, slow and steady. The aliens in the fortress stared at the distant lights, their hearts beating faster. Queen Leora joined Ray on the wall. I used to think we were strong, she said quietly. But when our allies left us, I saw how weak we were. And then you came. Just one man, why? Ray kept his eyes on the horizon. Because someone should. Sometimes that's all it takes. She didn't fully understand his answer, but the tone in his voice made something inside her chest tighten. As the first enemy ships broke through the clouds, alarms echoed through the fortress. Cannons aimed toward the sky. The enemy fleet roared like thunder, shaking the ground as they approached. It wasn't a small force anymore. It was an entire army. The alien soldiers took their positions. Oren stood by the north wall. Teams waited by the east gate. Ray adjusted the power flow at the south generator. Leora walked through the lines, her presence giving strength to her people. The first wave came down like a storm of fire. Enemy drop pods smashed into the ground outside the walls. Mechanical walkers emerged, their red eyes glowing. Drones flew in tight formations, their weapons ready. Ray raised his rifle and gave a single nod to Leora. Now. Explosions burst along the north wall. The towers crumbled exactly as planned. The enemy walkers in the front line were crushed under falling stone. Dust and fire filled the night. Alien soldiers cheered as the sky lit up. On the east side, a squad of enemy troops rushed forward, believing the gate was weak. The moment they crossed, mines exploded beneath their feet. The gate slammed shut behind them like a trap, sealing them inside. Alien defenders rained fire from above, cutting them down before they could react. Ray stayed at the south wall. The main enemy force advanced. Hundreds of drones hovered in the air, protecting massive siege tanks. He aimed carefully, firing burst after burst, hitting weak points no one else could see. Each shot bought them seconds they needed to survive. The drones turned their weapons on him. Energy blasts slammed into the walls, shaking everything around. Ray ducked behind broken stone, returned fire, and shouted into his comm. South wall under heavy fire. Leora's voice came back firm. Hold, Ray. Reinforcements coming. Oren and his unit rushed down from the north after their trap succeeded. They joined Ray at the south, firing their plasma rifles in perfect rhythm. Ray shouted directions, pointing out weak points in the enemy line. The aliens followed his lead without hesitation. One of the siege tanks broke through the minefield, heading straight for the shield generator. Ray grabbed a grenade, ran forward, and slid under the machine as plasma bolts burned the ground around him. He planted the grenade and rolled out just in time. The explosion sent the massive tank flipping backward in flames. The alien soldiers roared with renewed strength. Leora watched from the command tower. Her hands tightened around the rail. She saw how one man turned a hopeless defense into a storm of resistance. He moved through fire like it was nothing. He shouted, planned, fought, and the enemy began to falter. The enemy fleet sent in their elite force next. Heavy armor, stronger drones, and fast strike troops. They crashed against the fortress like a wave. Ray climbed the broken stairs, blasting through drones with precise shots. He moved like someone who had done this 100 times. Oren was hit by shrapnel, falling to one knee. Ray ran to him, dragged him behind cover, and returned fire before saying a word. Oren looked at him with wide eyes. "You fight like an army," Oren breathed. Ray shook his head. "No, we fight like a wall." The alien defenders roared behind them, standing their ground even as the enemy poured in. The fortress that once felt like a graveyard was now burning with life. Hours passed like minutes. The enemy tried again and again, but they couldn't break the defense. Ray's traps, the soldiers' courage, and Leora's command held them together. Then the enemy unleashed their final weapon, a towering war machine taller than the fortress walls. Its steps shook the ground like a giant hammer. Cannons on its arms glowed with deadly light. Ray looked up at it, breathing hard. "That's a big one," he muttered. Leora's voice came through the comm. "We can't take that down with our weapons," he thought quickly, eyes scanning the wall. "Then we bring the wall down on it." He ordered the soldiers to set charges on the last standing tower. It was risky. If it failed, the wall would be open. But if it worked, the enemy's weapon would fall with it. The war machine advanced. The charges went live. Ray waited until it stepped just under the tower. Now, the explosion ripped through the air. The old tower collapsed in a storm of stone and dust. The war machine was buried under the falling structure, its cannons crushed. The defenders erupted in cheers. Leora watched the scene from above, her chest tight with pride and awe. But Ray wasn't done. He climbed the wall one last time and aimed his rifle at the enemy commander ship hovering above. He fired into its exposed engine vents, striking the same spot over and over. Finally, the ship exploded, lighting up the night sky. The enemy line broke. Their formation scattered. Panic spread through their ranks. Queen Leora raised her voice through the fortress comm system. "Push them back." Alien soldiers charged out of the gates for the first time. They were no longer defending. They were winning. As the sun began to rise over the broken land of Turnus, smoke filled the air, but the enemy was retreating. The fortress, though scarred, still stood. Soldiers hugged each other. Oren limped toward Ray, bloodied but smiling. "We did it," he said. Ray wiped the dust from his face and nodded. "No, you did it." Queen Leora stood at the highest tower, watching her people rise from despair. She had begged for help and no one had answered, except one human. A single man who fought like an army and made her people remember who they were. The battle wasn't just one with guns and traps. It was one with will. And for the first time in a long time, hope burned bright over Turnus. The battlefield was quiet. The sun rose over the horizon, turning the broken land golden. Smoke curled from the ruins of the enemy fleet. The fortress still stood, though its walls were cracked and scarred. Alien soldiers walked among the rubble, helping the wounded, carrying supplies and pulling down enemy banners. For the first time in many long weeks, the cries of war were gone. Ray stood near the southern wall, where the biggest fight had taken place. His armor was dented, his uniform torn, and blood was dried on his forehead. But he was standing tall, breathing the cold morning air. Around him, alien soldiers moved with a new energy. There was pain in their faces, but also something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Oren limped toward him, holding his side. His uniform was torn, but he was smiling. "I thought this fortress would be my grave," Oren said, his voice hoarse. "But you proved me wrong, human." Ray gave a tired smile. "It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about not giving up." Oren nodded slowly, looking at the rising sun. "No one ever answered our queen's call. No one came to save us. I thought we were alone in this universe." Ray leaned against a broken piece of wall, watching the soldiers work. "Sometimes help doesn't come from armies. Sometimes it's just one person who decides to show up." Queen Leora walked down from the command tower. She was no longer wearing her shining ceremonial armor. It was scratched and burned, like everything else around her. Her golden cape dragged across the ground, covered in dust, but her steps were steady, and her head was held high. When she reached the courtyard, every alien soldier nearby stopped what they were doing. They turned to her, waiting. Ray straightened, brushing the dust from his shoulder. Leora's sharp eyes swept over the battlefield, then landed on him. She walked forward slowly, passing rows of kneeling soldiers. The respect in their eyes was clear, not just for her but for the man standing at the center of their victory. "You came when no one else did," she said as she approached Ray. "You fought with us. You stood on these walls when our own allies turned their backs." Ray didn't speak at first. He simply nodded. "I did what anyone should do." Leora shook her head slightly. "No, many could have answered the call, but only you did." The soldiers around them began to gather. Word spread fast through the fortress. The human who came alone. The man who helped turn despair into victory. Soldiers leaned on broken rifles, bandaged their wounds, and watched the quiet exchange between their queen and the human. Leora took a step closer. Her voice was strong, but softer than it had ever been. "Our history will remember this day. It will remember that when the stars were silent and the world was burning, a human stood with us." Ray looked at her, unsure what to say. He never came here for glory. He never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He came because no one else would. Behind the walls, alien engineers worked to rebuild the shield generator. Smoke rose from the enemy ships that had crashed near the forest line. Drones flew through the sky, scanning for any remaining threats. But it was clear now. The war on Turnus had ended. Ray walked through the ruined halls with Leora beside him. She showed him the broken throne room, where she had sent the first distress signal weeks ago. The console still flickered weakly. "I sent that signal every night," she said softly. "I watched the stars, hoping someone would answer. One by one, our friends stopped replying. I thought the galaxy had forgotten us." Ray touched the side of the console. "Sometimes the galaxy does forget. But sometimes, someone listens." She turned to him with tired eyes. "Why did you listen?" He thought for a moment. "Because if it was my home, I would want someone to listen too." The queen stopped walking. In the broken throne room, light from the rising sun fell on the cracked floor. She lowered her head for a moment, then slowly knelt down in front of him. Her soldiers gasped softly, the sound echoing through the hall. Ray stepped back slightly, surprised. "What are you doing?" Leora raised her head. Her voice was steady. "A queen kneels only to those who save her people. You didn't have an army. You didn't ask for reward. Yet you gave us something no one else would, your courage." The alien soldiers outside the hall began to kneel as well. One by one, their weapons touched the ground. Even Oren, leaning on his injured leg, lowered himself in respect. Ray felt something heavy in his chest. He never wanted this. He wasn't a king or a savior. He was just a man who heard a call and chose to answer. "Stand up," he said quietly. "I don't need this." But Leora shook her head. "This is not for you. This is for what you gave us. Hope." The alien soldiers rose slowly, their faces calm and proud. Leora stood too. "The fortress will rise again," she said. "But it will never forget this night. Every child on Turnus will grow up knowing the story of the lone human who came from the stars." Ray sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hope they don't make it sound too big. I just showed up." Leora smiled faintly. "That is exactly what makes it big." Later that day, repair work began. The soldiers cleared the battlefield, built new walls, and fixed what they could. The smell of fire mixed with the scent of metal and stone. It was no longer the smell of war. It was the smell of rebuilding. Ray walked through the camp. Everywhere he went, soldiers nodded to him. Some saluted. Some just smiled. Their respect wasn't loud, but it was real. Oren sat on a broken crate near the wall, wrapping a bandage around his arm. He looked up when Ray approached. "The queen has called a council," Oren said. "She wants to speak to the whole fortress." Ray raised an eyebrow. "I'm not much of a speech person," Oren chuckled. "You don't have to be. They already heard your speech on the wall last night. You spoke with your actions." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the entire fortress gathered in the courtyard. Torches burned along the broken walls, lighting the faces of hundreds of alien soldiers. Queen Leora stood on a platform. Her voice carried across the silent night. When darkness closed in, when we thought we were forgotten, one voice answered. One man came through the storm. He did not come for power. He did not come for reward. He came because we needed him. She extended her hand toward Ray. The fortress of Turnus stands because of this human. Let the galaxy hear this name, and let every star remember this night. The soldiers raised their weapons high. Their voices echoed in one powerful cheer that shook the air. It wasn't just celebration. It was rebirth. Ray stood beside her, feeling both proud and uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people cheering for him. He preferred being quiet, fixing things, doing what had to be done. But here, in this place that had once been broken, their cheers carried meaning. Leora leaned closer and whispered, "You gave us back our courage. That is something even kings cannot do." Ray didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, watching the lights of the torches dance across the night sky. In the days that followed, the fortress became a symbol across the nearby systems. Messages began to arrive from other worlds. Some offered help. Some asked for alliances. The galaxy that had ignored their cries now remembered them. And at the center of it all was the story of the lone human who answered the call when no one else did. Ray spent most of his time with the engineers, helping rebuild. He repaired generators, patched walls, and fixed weapons. When someone tried to treat him like a leader, he always said the same thing, "I'm just helping." But to the people of Turnus, he was more than that. On the 7th day after the battle, Leora met Ray near the rebuilt south wall. The sky was clear and the stars shone brightly. She stood beside him, silent for a while, just watching the stars. "Are you leaving?" she finally asked. Ray nodded slowly. "There are other signals out there. Other people who might need help." Leora turned to him. "And if we need you again?" He looked at her with a small smile. "Then I'll come." She extended her hand and he shook it firmly. No words were needed after that. When his small ship lifted off from the fortress, the soldiers stood in rows along the wall. They didn't shout. They didn't make speeches. They simply raised their weapons in salute as the ship disappeared into the sky. Queen Leora stood at the highest tower watching the stars. She whispered softly to herself. When no one answered, humanity did. The story of that night would spread across the galaxy, told in every corner where hope seemed lost. A human had come alone. He had fought, and because of him a world stood free. And somewhere in the endless night of space, Ray's ship moved toward the next call for help, because that's what he did.